Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 496 for the 22nd of April 2018. Richard Saunders here with you from Sydney, Australia. And I think there must have been a vote or something somewhere that we've voted not to have autumn this year. Autumn has been bypassed. I think we're going to go straight from summer to winter, if winter ever comes, and autumn will be scheduled for spring next year. That's the way it seems anyway. A long, long summer in Sydney, Australia. Now, really, folks, it is getting a little bit cooler these days. Big shout out to my sister and her family who just landed in Reykjavik. Wow, jealous. I'm so... Hello to all our Icelandic listeners. If you see a strange collection of Australians wandering about, it might be my sister and her family having a wonderful time in Iceland. So what's coming up on this week's show? We're going to kick off with our new reporter, Dr Paulie, with her random rant. And this week, Dr Paulie is going to be chatting to John Cook from the George Mason University, and he is studying climate change denial and reasoning. How people reason themselves, if that's the right term, into denying climate change and how you can possibly reason them out of it. What a fascinating study this is. And it reminds me that when I think about it, after all the years I've been looking into claims of the psychics and things like that, and I think honestly more and more it's a study of psychology more than anything else, because I've yet to, and anybody really, has yet to discover firm evidence for the paranormal. Therefore, it's hard to study that as a thing. It's more about studying how people's minds work, I think. Anyway, let's apply this to climate change, and I'm sure you'll find this interview with John Cook very interesting. Following that, it's some news about a vaccination clinic being run by Australian skeptics here in Sydney. Get your flu vaccination with us. That's coming up in May. More information soon. Then to round off the show, I interview Lauren Cochrane. Lauren Cochrane is the Australian Skeptics' new social media manager, reaching out via social media, via Facebook, via Twitter, via anything she possibly can to spread the skeptical message and get some interaction and some comment and feedback. I think you'll see that this position of a social media manager is more and more important in this world. And the online world and, well, any world. Couple of notes before we get started. If you'd like to keep up to date with what's happening with Australian skeptics, go to skeptics.com.au and subscribe to the newsletter. And that will be posted into your inbox, emailed into your inbox regularly so you know what's happening with Australian skeptics. And also a big shout out to my friend Mike Williams. Now, for most of last year, I had a regular segment along with Tim Mendham from Australian Skeptics on Mike Williams' radio show, which was, they call it The Graveyard Shift, the midnight to dawn on the weekends. A great show, lots of interviews and fun. And the Australian Skeptics were regularly on that show to discuss everything from UFOs to monsters to spontaneous human combustion to many, 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 many topics. Mike has been a bit under the weather, to say the least. He had some surgery lately, and he's recovering. So a big shout out to you, Mike Williams. Thank you so much for having the Australian Skeptics on your show, and we look forward to your speedy recovery. We wish you well and hope to hear you back on the airwaves soon. And when you do, the Australian Skeptics will be ready to be part of your show once again. And for those people in Australia, that was on the Macquarie network. Here in Sydney, that was on Radio 2GB. So yes, Mike, we look forward to your return. Stay tuned at the end of the show for another note from me about the cats. Yes. But now it's time for me to run down. In fact, I am downstairs. I'll give you a heads up. I'm downstairs. I'm trying a new thing. I've put the little recording booth up on the cat post. Yes, really, because the cat post's quite tall. And I'm standing in the middle of the lounge room here talking into a box with a microphone in it, sitting on a cat post, if you can visualize that. So now it's time for me to walk over to the kitchen, which is over there. Open the fridge. Oh, smoked salmon. I'll make some smoked salmon on toast. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Yeah! Let's have a random rant with Dr. Paulie.
I'm joined here today by Assistant Professor John Cook from the Centre for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. John is the founder of the award-winning Skeptical Science website and has co-authored several books on climate change, and has even developed a climate change denial MOOC, or massive online open course, at the University of Queensland. He's currently the co-host of the Evidence Squared podcast, which looks at why science fails to persuade. So safe to say, John, that you have a passion for fighting climate change misinformation and misinformation in general.
Yeah, well, it began as a hobby, and then it just grew and grew until it took over my whole life and eventually had me moving to another country. So it's a bit like that XKCD cartoon where the guy's on the internet and the wife asks, "When are you coming to bed?" And he said, "Someone is wrong on the internet."
Yeah, right. No, I have seen that one. So I guess before we start talking about some of your latest work, I just wanted to know a little bit more about the Skeptical Science website. And I guess for our listeners who haven't been on the website, it's almost like a one-stop shop for debunking just about every climate change denial argument ever uttered. What inspired you to start Skeptical Science, and how have you managed to keep it going for so many years?
What inspired me to start it was having arguments with my father-in-law.
Yes, family can be inspirational that way.
A particular type of inspiration. We would have our family get-togethers, and one lunch we started talking about climate change, and my father-in-law started throwing all these arguments against climate change and why it's not happening, why humans are causing it, why it's all a big hoax. And I went away and started looking into the science of what the actual, research found about climate change. And I found that he actually turned out to be completely false. It is real. It is caused by us. It is bad. In anticipation of the next family get-together, I did what I always do because I'm very much a nerd. I started building a database of every possible argument that he might present, and then collecting what the peer-reviewed science said about each particular argument. Over time, I was building up this database because I just really wanted to win that next argument. Then I realised other people also have father-in-laws or cranky uncles or people that they get into stoushes about climate change with that might also find this a useful resource. So I published it online as Skeptical Science.
I guess overcoming that first inspiration from your father-in-law, what sort of kept you keeping it going all these years?
When I started Skeptical Science, I was very conscious of the fact that it's possible to get into this trap, kind of like a hamster spinning in a wheel, where you're just blogging and throwing content down a hole. After years of blogging, you wonder what you've got to show for it. And so when I started Skeptical Science, I very consciously took the approach that rather than just posting blog post after blog post, rather I was trying to build up an encyclopedic resource. So the whole website was structured around the idea of having each denialist argument and then scientific explanations of it, and then just gradually building up that resource to make it more comprehensive and also up to date, because more research keeps coming down the pipeline. As I learnt more about the psychology of science denial, I learnt that people who reject science for ideological reasons, whether it's political belief or religious belief, there's almost no convincing them with evidence. Being aware of that, when you do engage with deniers, I find that it's actually good for your stress levels to recognise that you're probably not going to change their mind, but other people who are watching the exchange, they're your real audience. So when I engage with deniers, I try to use it as a teachable moment to inoculate everyone else against their misinformation.
And you bring up this concept of inoculation against misinformation a couple of times in your conversation articles, and more recently you sent me through your Plos One article on this topic. Can you elaborate a little bit on this concept of inoculation against misinformation? I've
been doing a PhD over the last 5 years into the question, how do we neutralise misinformation? Eventually I happened upon this body of research into inoculation, which it turns out is actually over 60 years old. It began around the 1950s. And I think what sparked it was American soldiers being kidnapped during the Korean War and then brainwashed with Korean propaganda. And researchers started looking into how can you inoculate people from being brainwashed. What they took was this idea, this metaphor of vaccination. We can vaccinate people against a disease by exposing them to a weak form of the disease, and that helps them build up immunity. So psychology researchers started testing, could you inoculate people against misinformation by exposing them to a weak form of the misinformation? And they found that it was actually one of the most effective ways of neutralizing misinformation. We're actually designing an experiment right now, testing the idea of inoculating against misinformation across a variety of topics, including climate change and vaccination. So if it turns out that inoculation is the way to stop vaccine denial, I think that would be a very poetic irony.
Just going back to what you did in your during your PhD or during this article that you sent me through, and we'll put that up on the show notes. You compared the effectiveness of inoculations with conditions where the misinforming messages were left uncorrected. Can you briefly describe what you did in terms of how did you inoculate people against misinformation and then evaluate the effect of that inoculation?
Yeah, so in our experiment, one of our experiments in my Plos One study, we took one of the most potent forms of climate misinformation, which is the argument that there's no scientific consensus on climate change because 31,000 scientists have signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. In my experiment, I had one group where I showed them this misinformation about the 31,000 dissenting scientists. And what we found was the misinformation had different impact on different types of people. People who were at the left-wing liberal side of the political spectrum, it had no effect. But people who were at the conservative end of the political spectrum, it had a strong effect in lowering their acceptance of climate change. That tells us that climate misinformation does have a negative effect, but it works stronger on certain people compared to other people. And in particular, it works strongest on political conservatives. In another group in my experiment, we inoculated them before we showed them the misinformation. And the inoculation message was basically just explaining the technique that the misinformation uses to distort the facts. And we didn't even mention the misinformation. We didn't mention the 31,000 scientists argument. We just said that one way to cast doubt on scientific consensus is to use fake experts, people who have the impression of being experts but don't have any actual relevant expertise. And we used some examples of tobacco advertising that use that same technique of fake experts to cast doubt on the scientific consensus that smoking causes cancer. So that was the inoculating message. Then we showed them the 31,000 scientists' misinformation, and we found that for that group, the misinformation was completely neutralised. It had no effect, and it didn't work whether people were liberal or conservative. It was neutralised across the political spectrum. And this is probably, I think, one of the most exciting aspects of the research. It means that you can neutralize misinformation, even if they're ideologically predisposed to believe the misinformation. And whether people are conservative or liberal, no one wants to be misled. No one wants to be tricked. If you can explain the techniques used to trick them, potentially you can neutralise that misinformation. I wrote a follow-up paper after the Plos One paper with some University of Queensland philosophers. We, offered some practical ways to expose logical fallacies and misinforming techniques using an approach called parallel argumentation. And the idea there is quite simple. Take the logical fallacy in a bad argument and translate that fallacy or translate that logic into a different context to make the bad logic obvious. I'll give you an example because what I've said sounds very abstract, but it's actually one of the most common arguments against climate change is that climate has changed naturally in the past, therefore what's happening now must be natural as well. It's probably the most common denialist argument. But if you take the logic of that argument and translate it into a different situation, you see just how ridiculous it is. It's like finding a dead body with a big knife sticking out of its back and saying, well, people have died of natural causes in the past, so this person must have died of natural causes as well. The argument commits the logical fallacy of non sequitur or jumping to conclusions.
I wanted to know from your experience, why do you think people are so invested in climate change being a hoax? And you did mention things like their own political or perhaps ideological backgrounds, and it's a bit evident in our current Australian and US government members. But what do you think is motivating these people the most?
A great study published by some University of Queensland researchers, actually, my colleagues Matthew Hornsey and Kelly Fielding, they did a meta-analysis or a survey of surveys. They looked at all the different studies examining what drives people's attitudes about climate change. And they found that there were lots of different factors, age, income, education level, so on. But the really two big ones that jumped up like skyscrapers compared to all the other drivers. Number two was political ideology. If you hold conservative beliefs, you believe in small government, you believe in free, unregulated markets, then you don't want to see markets like the fossil fuel industry get regulated. You don't like the solutions to climate change, like trying to restrict carbon emissions. And not liking the solutions, people tend to just deny that there's a problem in the first place. But the number one driver of climate denial is political affiliation. What political party you belong to, or what tribe do you belong to? This driver of people's attitudes is a universal human condition. We're all prey to it. The power of social norming is way more powerful than we would like to think. And so that's really a difficult barrier to overcome, because tribal affiliation is just a super powerful psychological driver.
I have to ask this one. Have you ever managed to turn a true climate skeptic, or how did you go with your father-in-law in trying to convince him?
As I said, it's almost impossible to change a climate denier's mind. And I learned with my father-in-law that people whose attitudes are not based on evidence can't be persuaded by evidence. And so, no, I haven't changed his mind. However, there have been a few cases. So I'm not saying that there's no hope. And probably the most prominent example in my life is my dad. So we also would have arguments about climate change. And then after years of arguing, one day my dad said, "Son, I do believe that humans are causing global warming." And I nearly fell off my chair. And, I was halfway through my PhD into the psychology of denial. So I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to peer under the hood. And so I just casually said, "So what changed your mind, Dad?" And he said, "Oh, no, I've always thought this." And so I thought, okay, I guess I won't get to peer under the hood. But eventually I think I figured out what happened with him. A few years prior to that, he figured out that it actually was a financial no-brainer for him to get solar panels on his roof. With the feed-in tariff in Queensland, a solar panels on your roof would actually get paid off within a few years, and then you get free electricity. He got solar panels, and every 3 months he'd call me up and tell me how much money he was getting in a cheque from the electricity company rather than having to pay a bill. And there's a curious thing with the human brain. When our behaviour and our beliefs conflict, we experience this discomfort called cognitive dissonance. And usually, like we might believe we should be good people, but we do something bad. And we have to try to, change our behaviour to come in line with our beliefs. But sometimes we can be behaving well, but believing something bad, and then the beliefs change to become consistent with the behaviour. I think that my dad was behaving environmentally, and then his beliefs evolved to become more environmentally friendly as well. And it just goes to show that belief and behaviour change aren't always a one-way street. It can go both ways. And so there's multiple avenues to changing both people's behaviour and their beliefs.
And perhaps just to end on a fun note, I guess, what's your favourite climate change argument to debunk?
My favourite argument to debunk, given that it's the most potent argument, the 31,000 dissenting scientists, my PhD was not only focused on the psychology of denial, it was also denial around one particular misconception, which was that there's no scientific consensus. I did a lot of studies, research, testing the impact of communicating the 97% consensus, the fact that 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. And that turns out to be one of the most potent statements or facts about climate change. It's just a single number. Communicate to people, the scientists agree, there's overwhelming scientific consensus, because most people don't realise that. Like when we published our first paper in 2013 communicating the 97% consensus, President Obama tweeted it, Prime Minister David Cameron mentioned it in a speech, and it got a hell of a lot of media attention. And so I guess it has been a lot of fun focusing on this.
Well, you're doing really good work, John, and I really appreciate you getting onto Skype with me all the way from the US. Wonders of technology and discussing your work, because I think it is something that we're all trying to do as skeptics, is to inoculate or neutralise misinformation, but definitely having some science behind the best way to do that will certainly help us all along the way. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Paulie.
What you? Oh, not the dreaded flu. Don't tell the anti-vaxxers. But Australian Skeptics Inc will be hosting a flu vaccination day for Sydney-siders at the East Sydney Doctors Clinic on Saturday the 19th of May from 2 p.m. You will need to register so we can keep tabs on the numbers, and that link can be found at skeptics.com.au. Look for the link in this week's show notes. The Royal Australian College of General Practitioners recommends that flu vaccinations should be timed to cover you during Australia's flu season, which runs from June to September, peaking in August. The protection offered by the vaccination may begin to wear off after 3 or 4 months, so an injection in May is good timing to maximise its effectiveness. While Australian Skeptics Inc will be donating 30 vaccines to attendees, you may be eligible for free vaccination under Medicare. Those eligible include all children aged 6 months to less than 5 years of age, all individuals aged 5 years and over with specific medical risk conditions, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 15 years and over, pregnant women, and people aged 65 and over. The flu vaccination clinic will be run by Australian Skeptics Inc committee members Dr Brad and Trish Han. Any unused vaccines will be donated to the community. Remember, bring your Medicare card. So, Sydney siders, if you're after a flu vaccination this year and you're free on the 19th of May, why not come along to the Australian Skeptics Inc. vaccination clinic? Links on this week's show notes.
Hello.
Hello. And joining me now all the way from sunny Brisbane is the Australian Skeptics Social Media and Community Manager, Lauren Cochrane. Hello, Lauren.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
I'm very well, Lauren. Very well indeed. I thought I'd give you a call, contact you, because you've recently started in this position as a social media and community manager, a bit of a mouthful, for the Australian Skeptics, and I was hoping that you could tell our audience a little bit about what you do and why you do it.
Yes, well, I've been in the role coming up to 2 months now, and a lot of that time has been looking at how social media for the organisation has been used in the past and strategising about how we can better use online and social media to communicate with skeptics and the general public.
And I think people who certainly follow the Australian Skeptics on Facebook, would notice, especially in the last 6 weeks or so, quite an increase in posting. How do you go about doing your job? Where do you get all these interesting posts?
Well, I happen to live on the internet. It's a very well-known fact. So I find the articles as they pop up and think, that's a really good one to share. I'll tuck that away and share that in a day or two. It's really a combination of hunting it down and dumb luck.
Dumb luck. And what's I mean, you don't just post purely skeptical things, and I'm the old school. When I think skeptical, and my mind is always racing for UFOs and talking to the dead and that sort of thing. But yeah, you're casting your net quite wide. I think things of general interest to skeptics.
Yes, and one of the things at the moment that I'm really focusing on, or trying to focus on, is the topic of vaccination, because the Australian Skeptics have their vaccination date coming up.
Yes.
And as part of that, I'm just trying to increase the knowledge of what's in the media at the moment about immunisation, so skeptics can read these articles, take it away with them, and have conversations with others that might not be skeptics or might not understand certain topics.
And how's the feedback going, especially on things like Facebook and Twitter and things like that? Are you finding that we're getting, when I say we're, I'm speaking with my Australian Skeptics hat on, more engagement?
Definitely. I am a data and analytics nerd. So I sit there and I've got my little dashboard that I can see that we've got so many likes and so many comments, and there's particular posts that just go viral. And I get, I do my little invisible fist pump and get quite excited when something just blows up in comparison to a regular everyday post.
Well, what's the topics that people like to reply to or interact with?
Definitely vaccination. That's a really a huge one as well, and also interestingly, Alex Jones.
Alex Jones.
Obviously, he's US-based, but he has such a massive reach in all of these lawsuits that are coming out, the defamation lawsuits that are coming out of the woodwork at the moment. I'm finding that those posts as well are generating quite a bit of interest.
Now, he forgive me if I haven't got this quite right. I think he's the one who is using the conspiracy theory that there are crisis actors for tragedies.
Correct. And now parents from Sandy Hook, one of the Florida Clearview shooters, and one of the other mass shootings as well, has come out and started to sue him for defamation, which is a good thing. And I'm really looking forward to watching those proceed through courts.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting because As listeners may well remember, last year I attended SciCon in Las Vegas, and one of the windows, in fact, the window of the room being used by the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, overlooked one of the areas where there was a mass shooting last year. So that was quite eerie. And to think that there are people hawking this conspiracy theory around that there are crisis actors and it's all a fake is quite insulting, really.
Yes, and it's really good to see them hopefully getting their comeuppance in court.
Well, I'm not surprised. This is the sort of thing you're finding that people like to interact with. Now, just briefly, Lauren, you're no stranger to the world of skepticism, are you?
No, I've been involved in skepticism for about the same amount of time I've been involved in social media. I was only thinking about this the other day, that my first role in social media and online communications was 10 years ago, and that was about the time that I started to think, maybe I'm a skeptic. And then I found the Australian Skeptics and started going to the conventions and starting to meet people in real life. So, yeah, it's quite fitting now that I am now working with the Australian Skeptics.
Yeah, I think the first time I met you was in Canberra at an Australian Skeptics convention. And people may remember you or may like to know that in my documentary I made a few years back called The Vaccination Chronicles, right at the beginning of the movie, there's a little, the musical theme, and there's this wonderful mum in the playground with her two tiny little kids running around, and that's you.
That is, and my babies, yes, and they're far too big now.
It's a wonderful little time capsule, and at the end of the documentary, you can be seen where we interviewed you about your feelings about it. But I always liked looking at the beginning because we found a nice little park, and your daughter's running around going up the slippery dip, and I think it's just a wonderful little segment.
Yes, it's very cute to see both of them looking so chubby-cheeked and happy, yes.
Not so little anymore. Lauren,
No.
it's great to have you working for the Australian Skeptics in this capacity. And as I know from your reports, the increase in our interactivity, or I don't know how you'd phrase that exactly, our feedback and our online presence has been helped even at this early stage. What's the idea going forward? What do you foresee happening?
Well, I have to keep a few things under my hat and reveal it in time. But I do think that it's a sign of a forward-thinking, sceptical organisation to appoint a dedicated social media person, because volunteer committee members like yourself, you've got lives, you've got committee meetings and subcommittee meetings and all of that stuff that goes with it. So to keep social media channels running and to think strategically about what can we do next, that's a big ask for a volunteer to do in amongst everything else that they've got going on in their lives. And I guess that's how I fit into the picture. I can be the eyes, mouth and ears of the organisation while the committee does all of the important stuff and find some balance in their lives. While I'm looking at how we can better utilise our existing social media channels, I'm also looking at can we look at other channels? Can we reach out to the general public in different ways on, I'll throw a couple of social media networks around, but Instagram or Snapchat, how can we use platforms like that to communicate a skeptical message?
I think it's absolutely, in this day and age, Lauren, I think this is absolutely vital. And I was just an old memory flashed across my mind. Some years back, you and I were together and we were doing something, and I was trying to look up something on my iPad or on my iPhone, and I was having trouble, and you grabbed it off me and said, "Here, give it to a millennial. I'll show you how to do it."
I think I'm technically classed as a zennial.
A what?
Now? A zennial.
What's that?
With an X. Apparently we're a very unique breed, somewhere between 1980 and 1983.
Good grief.
So people can surmise my age from that.
Oh, these terms, it gets a bit too much. Lauren,
yes.
Thank you so much for your work so far. It's great to have you on board. And again, I think we're seeing the results. And folks, out there who are involved in skeptical movements around the world, if you don't have a dedicated media manager, maybe it's something you should look into, because I think so far the Australian skeptics are noticing the benefits. Lauren Cochrane, I look forward to our next meeting, but for now, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Skeptical 2018. Conference registration is now open. Registration for Skeptical 2018 conference, the 9th Northern California gathering on science and skepticism, is now open. Skeptical is excited to bring a stellar list of speakers on timely and important topics to you this June. This year's event will be held at the Shattuck Hotel Plaza in Berkeley, California, on Sunday the 10th of June 2018. The diverse speakers will give you tools to understand bad science and fake news, enlighten you about homelessness and artificial intelligence, protect your children from being hacked, and maybe even by being abducted by aliens. Information on the speakers and their topics can be found at the website skepticalcon.com. Skeptical work hard to make this a thought-provoking, timely subjects, top-notch, world-class speakers, low cost, under $50, one-day conference. Discount rates are available before the 15th of May. To grab those early tickets and for more information, visit skepticalcon.com or just look for the links in this week's show notes. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. Now, news about the Skeptic Zone cats. As some of you may have noticed about a week ago, Maud, the Skeptic Zone cat, one of them, was looking up into the shelves the other week, and saw my little plaster statue of an alien playing a guitar. Yes, a bit strange. Looked at it. Suddenly a paw shot up and boom! It fell over and smashed into two. And she was very pleased with herself. Anyway, I've glued it back together. So I've got an alien-hating cat living in the house. If the aliens invade, I'll be safe. Or maybe if they saw that photograph, they won't invade. A big shout-out to my friend Eugenie Scott in California. And I hope the SkepticalCon coming up in June will be a major success. I really must try to see if I can get along to that, folks. I'd like to do that. I'd like to go to SkepticalCon in Berkeley. Berkeley's quite nice. I like the squirrels. I think I go to San Francisco really to partake of the clam chowder in the sourdough bowl. If you're going to San Francisco, forget about the flowers in your hair, folks. Have that sourdough bowl with the clam chowder. Coming up soon on the Skeptic Zone, we're going to be having reports by the Raw Skeptic, Heidi Robinson up in the north coast of New South Wales, and I think pretty soon we're going to be having another report from Mandy Lee Noble, the Diet Skeptic. But for this week, with no cats anywhere, can't see them anywhere. I'll tell you what I did. I went to a what we call a $2 shop. You've probably got the same sort of thing in your neck of the woods. This is a shop that sells very cheap, usually Chinese imports, mostly made out of plastic. You get all sorts of things there. And I bought a green back scratcher. Green plastic back scratcher and shoehorn in one for $1. And the cats have discovered, or I have discovered, that they just love it. Being scratched on the back and the tummy with a back scratcher. Maybe I should call this show the Cat Zone. Anyway, while I run away and scratch their backs, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.